I want to thank, first of all, ISI for hosting this wonderful event and bringing all these wonderful people here, and also the panelists who have agreed to participate in the Global Replacement Reading Renaud Camus in and Beyond the French Context discussion. So it's nice that we'll be discussing a thoroughly uncontroversial topic here with the Great Replacement. So I want to give just a little bit of background here, because there's a need to disentangle the polemical misrepresentation of this term from what Renaud Camus actually meant by it. He, after all, coined the term in 2011 and had come up with it and not used it much earlier than that, in the 1990s in France. So what's the polemical distortion or misrepresentation of the Great Replacement? Well, it's the idea that there are some nefarious mandarins rubbing their palms together in some room, plotting to replace the native populations of Europe and the Americas with third world cohorts. Now, maybe there are some people who think along these lines. Soon-to-be former head of the the Department of Homeland Security, I wonder. But anyway, this is decidedly not what Camus means by the Great Replacement. It has nothing to do with a conspiracy or even a theory. In fact, it's purely observational. What is the Great Replacement? Simply put, it is the changing of people. You have one group of people, and then over a period of time, suddenly you have two or three or even more sharing the same territory. A good case of this that we're probably all aware of is the immense demographic shift that London has undergone in the last 50 or 60 years. Around 1960, London was over 90% white British. Now it's under 40%. And we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it nonetheless has happened. It's simply a matter of observation. Camus does have a theory, nonetheless. He calls it global replacism. And mass migration is simply an instance of this larger phenomenon. What does he mean by it? Well, it's the logic of the replaceability of all things. You start with consumer products, but eventually it moves its way along to human beings as well. And mass migration and the indifference to people's roots and their culture is a manifestation of this ideology. So one reason that that the distorted, really sort of invented version of what the Great Replacement was able to proliferate is because Camus' writing was never available in English. You had all these journalists condemning this fellow, condemning his term, who did not read him, really didn't have an opportunity to read him. And that changed just about a year ago when my colleague Ethan Rundell and I published with our new publishing venture the first authorized English translation of Camus' most significant political writings. And there are books available there if anybody would like to look at them. One final thing to note, we have seen some what I'll call anti-replacist discourse emerge recently on the political scene. Vivek Ramaswamy, you'll probably recall, talked about the Great Replacement as basically the electoral strategy of the Democratic Party. We've had Elon Musk talk about the importation of illegal immigrants to Midwestern swing states is an attempt to eventually sway elections there. Even J.D. Vance, a bit more subtly, has talked about people, territory, in his, I believe it was his acceptance speech at the RNC conference. He claimed that, America is not just an idea, it's a history, it's a people. So I don't know that any of these fellows have read any of Camus' essays, but perhaps they have. I wouldn't be surprised. All right, that's all I wanted to say in preface. So let's move on to our presenters. Let's start first with Nathan. Nathan Pinkoski is assistant professor at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. He contributes to First Things, to Compact, and he published an essay in Compact in 2022 about Renaud Camus. And he's going to talk about the logic of replacement, moving from objects to human beings. Rod Dreher. Rod Dreher is an American journalist who writes about politics, culture, religion, and foreign affairs. A veteran of 3 decades of magazine and newspaper journalism, he has also written 3 New York Times bestsellers, Live Not by Lies, The Benedict Option, and The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, as well as Crunchy Cons and How Dante Can Save Your Life. He also has a book that just came out, Living in Wonder. He is the director of the network project of the Danube Institute in Budapest, where he lives. N.S. Lyons is an essayist and author of the very popular Substack, The Upheaval, and he's well known for his essay, The China Convergence. And then finally, R.R. Reno is the editor of First Things magazine. He was formerly a professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University. Reno is the author of several books and serves as the general editor for the Brazos Theological Commentary on the Bible series. His scholarly work ranges widely in systematic and moral theology, as well as in controverted questions of biblical interpretation. All right. Nathan? Yeah, let me get this out of the way.
All right, thank you very much to ISI for hosting this panel. I think it's one of these occasions whereby a panel like this would never be able to take place in a university setting. So it's really a gift to have an organization like ISI that is able to take a controversial thinker like this and discuss him with fairness and reflect upon his ideas. So begin with gratitude to ISI and of course to Louis Belli for his work in putting this notion together, for translating along with Ethan Rundell, who's out there as well. Another note of gratitude towards him. And please, I'll plug the book on their behalf. Please, please, please look at the copy there. Purchase them if you like. Order more for friends. All right, let's begin. In the 21st century, to be Western means to be replaceable. There's one person who understands the full contours of that, Renaud Camus. And in my talk, I want to convince you that because of this, Camus is poised to become one of the most important political thinkers of our century. Camus owed his initial fame to avant-garde literature. For those of you who don't know the details of his biography, he came out as a gay man in the late 1960s, was disinherited, and wrote novels in very avant-garde circles, gay novels, and that had been the source of his reputation and the source of his elite reputation. Very well regarded and respected in the circles of avant-garde elite literary circles and so forth. And had it not been for a single event, Camus' thought might have been consigned to the ambiguous enclaves of postmodern literary theory. That event was when Camus first perceived the effects of mass immigration. In 1999, while writing a guide for tourists for a region in the French countryside, Camus noticed women in veils gathering near a well. Mass immigration had hit rural France, and the migrants were not changing their customs to match France's culture. We might proceed immediately to begin talking about mass immigration, but Camus' reflections since that event proceed in a different way. It invites us first to pause and ask why noticing the effects of mass immigration is so hard to do. There are simple answers that we often hear or give: political correctness, indoctrination, a conscious desire not to see. But we often doubt, deny, or downplay what we notice because we Westerners have long been subject to a deeper epistemological shift. We live in an age when the authority of perception has been replaced by scientific authority. If you want to know what light is, you can't describe it yourself. You must talk to a physicist. If you want to know what a woman is, you have to ask a biologist. The real world is not what we see. Reality needs to be mediated by a scientific authority. This epistemic shift, Camus argues, has wide-ranging political and social implications. When science becomes the authoritative standard of truth, those who speak on behalf of science become our clerics, our preachers. When scientific experts speak, the public is, quoting Camus now, dispossessed of their vision, their personal experience, their judgment. We outsource these faculties to experts, and we often prefer to live with the result because it takes away the pain or grief that comes with judgment. We Westerners have come to accept that our perception is replaceable. Nothing is lost by this change. Perhaps we're even better off. This shift to scientific expertise privileges one particular form of knowledge over others. It displaces traditional modes of understanding reality, particularly music, literature, and poetry, of great concern to a literary man like Camus. Scientism of this kind is the antagonist of high culture. Its challenge to high culture is rendered even more powerful by the shift in class that Camus argues took place in the latter half of the 20th century. Every culture has a referent social class. Culture relies on a particular social class to create and transmit it. France's classics in music, literature, and poetry were first written and handed down by the aristocracy. However, it was the 19th century bourgeoisie that turned this relatively insular culture into a public one, building museums, concert halls, and opera houses. The Palais Garnier, if those who've ever been to Paris and seen that building, dates from that period. Moreover, the bourgeoisie invented and promulgated national education to teach and transmit this culture to the next generation. This educational system, the educational system of the Third Republic, the bourgeois republic, focused especially on elite education and touted its capacity to raise provincials, the peasants, to the highest levels of society. It was democratic, it reached millions, yet it sought excellence, virtue, vertu, manliness, and strengthen the cultural inheritance. However, democracy, and Camus here means equality, burst the bounds of politics and law. It began to change society. With the onset of what Camus calls hyper-democracy, the educational preoccupations of the bourgeois were denigrated as elitist and anti-democratic. The focus on excellence became a scandal. A new culture emerged, shaped by the new social class that replaced the old. This referent class is the petty bourgeoisie. Their revolution, Camus contends, is the revolution of May 1968. Petty bourgeois culture is pop culture. Cartoons and detective stories replace literature. Music means pop music, and that's what passes for poetry. The new culture is embarrassed by its connection to the old. It cut its connection and pushed the representatives of the old bourgeois culture aside. It eradicated the old culture while being itself a culture that teaches eradication, a cancel culture writ large, in both senses. Downstream of this transformation, we come to believe that our educated class is replaceable. And since that class produced our culture, it also means that we believe that our culture is replaceable. Nothing is lost by the change. Perhaps we're even better off. This is the phenomenon that Camus has called at various points the great deculturation, decivilization, or the little replacement. We can now begin to understand how those veiled Muslims ended up in rural France. The French, along with other Westerners, stopped seeing their own culture as something excellent, something worth protecting and transmitting. It could be substituted out for something novel. So if culture is replaceable and nothing is lost in the change, then the imposition of new cultures upon the old and new peoples upon the old who bring new cultures poses no danger. The old way of life, the old culture, and the old peoples are all expendable. Indeed, replacing them might even make us better off. Nations, entire peoples, are replaceable. By losing the capacity to perceive their own cultural excellence, our own cultural excellence, we Westerners lost the capacity to perceive how mass immigration would displace our own cultures and displace our own peoples. Mass immigration is not the work of a cabal, but of a cultural shift within the West that made mass immigration appear possible and desirable. The little replacement created the conditions for the great replacement. And that, Camus argues, is the world we have lived in since the 1970s. Our peoples are being replaced. But Camus takes us still deeper. So far we've noted an epistemic change, a class change, cultural change, and demographic change, the substitution of one people for another. But this doesn't fully explain how we got here. To do that, we need to understand the anthropological change that has taken place. Now, multiculturalism, anti-racism, has us think that where there was once one culture and one peoples, there can now be many cultures, but still one peoples. And the anti-racist component of that is, of course, to enforce that as the notion that has to be true. You can add and subtract cultures from a people over time. This, multiculturalists argue, is simply Western history. We've always been a diverse society, and this is just another stage of diversity. But if you think cultures can be added and subtracted from human beings over time, without changing anything substantial about their communities, then what do you think human beings actually are? Camus has the answer: resources. To resolve the tension between many cultures and one people, the presupposition is that a people is not defined by a shared culture, but as a productive material unit. Peoples are defined not by culture, but by economic output. The transformation of humanity into resources is the process of 20th century managerialism or Taylorianism. More than just a set of methods to boost production in the workplace or standardized machinery, managerialism is a mode of encountering reality, bringing with it a new anthropology and a fundamental ontology. Managers see the world in terms of resources to be utilized, what Martin Heidegger calls standing reserve. Workers are taught to perceive themselves in the same way. This makes them more compliant, easier to administer, and easier to replace. Men are treated and arranged as machines, and they come to perceive themselves as such. In Camus' vocabulary, men become undifferentiated human matter. This is Camus' richest argument. In the 19th century, democracy began to break the bounds of politics and redefined our social, cultural, and moral order. It changed the anthropological order. It produced Homo democraticus, or perhaps Homo americanus, who perceives the world through the lens of equality. Sameless. Of course, you get all that from Tocqueville, but Camus notes something else. By the 20th century, this hyper-democracy made us ashamed of excellence and ashamed of our inheritance. That's something that Tocqueville foresaw, but something else was happening alongside this. Management broke the bounds of industry and redefined our very social, cultural, and moral order. And this has come with a silent but startling anthropological change. It produced what we might call global Homo economicus, who perceives the world through the lens of replacism. So now we are able to see that for Camus, the great replacement, mass migration, mass immigration, may be the political issue of our times, but it is not the issue. The issue is the managerial, mechanical, technological revolution that substitutes us out for machines. We have learned that our humanity is replaceable. So as Camus puts it, a specter is haunting Europe and the world. It is replacism, the tendency to replace everything with its normalized, standardized, interchangeable double, the original by the copy, the authentic by its imitation, the true by the false, mothers by surrogate mothers, culture by leisure activities and entertainment, knowledge by diplomas, the countryside and the city by the universal suburb, the native by the non-native, Europe by Africa, men by women, men and women by robots, peoples by other peoples, humanity by a savage, undifferentiated, standardized, infinitely interchangeable post-humanity, end quote. As this passage indicates, Camus grasps the full implications of technological change and raises the urgent question of the human place in this revolutionary upheaval. Replacism demands everything to be reordered to standing reserve. Limits and borders interfere with that. Openness, destroying borders and limits, is managerialism's moral imperative. The borderless ontology of replacism affects the large, nations, whole peoples, but it also affects the small, down to the human body. In the borderless ontology of replacism, the human body itself must become a resource. Mothers replaced by surrogate mothers, men by women, men and women by robots. The ideal human body is turned into placeless, sexless, interchangeable flesh. Our bodies are replaceable. Those who are left out are perceived as abandoned inventory, the losers of globalization, of multiculturalism, of anti-racism, of mass migration, men living without meaningful work, women living in fear of walking at dusk, the surrogate babies abandoned or killed when those who contracted them into life, changed their minds, the excess embryos discarded after IVF. This is the Western world today. It's the worldview that rules over us, which shapes how we think and how we perceive the world. We have acquiesced to inhumanity. And this recalls some of the claims made in those ambiguous enclaves of postmodern literary theory with which I began. One of the claims is that the experience of colonization is not so much about brute force, but about acquiring a mindset of inferiority. That is how colonization is effective. That's an insight worth bearing in mind today as we, like Camus, try to confront this system. Westerners must task themselves with getting rid of their bad shepherds, their ersatz educators, their occupiers, and the mediocre managers, the davocrats in Camus' term, who collaborate with the occupiers. But more importantly, we must bring an end to the lens of inferiority through which we have come to regard ourselves. We must resist the anthropology that reduces our humanity to a commodity of flesh, an anthropology that hollows out our interiority, an ontology that will not permit that interiority to have any substantial existence. Our task is not to preserve or defend the West. If Camus is right, we are way past that point. Our task is to decolonize the West. Thank you.
Well, I quite appreciate your closing lines there, Nathan, because in his writings, Renaud Camus sometimes, occasionally, strikingly describes the ongoing replacement of Western peoples and cultures as a form of counter-colonization, or simply as colonization, full stop. And I find this word very intriguing, colonization, because while Camus naturally is speaking of colonization in the context of mass migration, highlighting the irony of Europe's former colonial powers being overrun by the very peoples they once colonized, I think there's much more to the idea than that. In fact, if we do begin thinking of the Western world as having been subject to a process of colonization, it can help us, I think, explain not only the phenomenon of uncontrolled mass migration, but also the much broader notion of replacism that Camus is trying to describe. Moreover, it can, I believe, also explain the real root causes of the cultural decline and political strife we see consuming the West today, including the great populist backlash that we've just seen so well expressed in the election. So, woke left-wing rants about decolonization that we're all used to aside, I think we ought to take a real look at what the process of colonialism actually does involve, and practically and historically. So almost universally, the first imperative of colonialism is denationalization. Colonialism is something waged by empires, supranational political entities that control many different nations or peoples under one imperial umbrella. The antithesis of empire is national identity and national self-determination, which is why the chief task of any colonial occupier is so often the suppression or erasure of a ruled population's conception of themselves as a coherent people with a distinct cultural identity and a delimited historical territory. The second imperative of colonialism is similarly a process of deculturalization. It is the stripping away of a people's traditional culture, customs, beliefs, values, and language. It is a deliberate severing of the historical roots and abolition of historical memory, including through censorship, propaganda, indoctrination, and desacralization of a people's traditional religion. Often it is specifically children who are targeted for programs of re-education, sometimes even deliberately removed from the culture of their parents so that they can be raised apart. This deculturalization is liable, however, to be presented as a benevolent civilizing process, the liberation of a people from their backwards, barbaric, provincial ways, so that they may adopt the superior cultural values and ways of life of their more advanced colonial masters. To maintain control as they engage in this process of denationalization and deculturalization, a colonial power is likely to employ a particular and characteristic strategy of divide and rule. They establish a social and political hierarchy that artificially privileges one or more chosen ethnic or religious minority groups to rule over the native majority. The empire does so because it knows that minority groups in such a multicultural administrative system are likely to remain far more loyal to the empire than to their own nation, having been taught to fear the prospect of national democratic rule by a majority which indeed often comes to resent them. Racial and sectarian tensions began to boil. Meanwhile, the cultural and political dispossession of a native people is inevitably accompanied by an economic dispossession and exploitation. Gradually or all at once, what was once theirs is taken from them and redistributed to the colonizers and their preferred client groups. Natives' land may be seized, or overbearing laws, taxes, and regulations leveraged to gradually make it less and less economically feasible for them to retain ownership of their business and property. The empire may also deliberately subvert national industry, preventing economic challenges to its international monopolies. Financial methods may be used to exploit the nation and its people by trapping them in a complex web of inescapable debts. And native people themselves are strip mined for their value as human resources. They may be used as cheap labor or conscripted as military cannon fodder and sent abroad to fight the empire's foreign wars. Or more cleverly, the empire will steadily siphon off the brightest and best and most promising young natives, draining them away from their hometowns to distant metropolitan capitals, to be decultured, re-educated, and co-opted into serving the transnational imperial system as people from nowhere. But, of course, the most traumatic form of dispossession a colonial power can inflict on a nation is something far more fundamentally transformative. That is the displacement of a native people from their ancestral land and way of life, accomplished via mass inward migration of an outside group, whether the colonizers themselves or another people. As their demographic and cultural majority is weakened by this human tide, natives' relative political voice and control over institutions and resources is inexorably undermined. Soon they find themselves strangers in their own land. This is a colonial strategy of terrible and permanent effectiveness. It is one that the People's Republic of China, for example, has in our own time used very successfully in the territories of Tibet and Xinjiang, where it has transferred millions of ethnic Han Chinese settlers in to dilute and assimilate the local ethnic populations, transforming them into weak, isolated minorities with a degraded identity and sense of ever having been a distinct people. In truth, once such an underhanded invasion has been completed, there is no going back for a nation. They have been effectively erased from the map and from history. And so when such inward migration is, as in China, also combined with efforts to actively reduce the population of the native group over time, such as through the suppression of fertility, this is today rightfully recognized in international law as a form of genocide. Now, natives are, of course, naturally unlikely to take such colonial dispossession lying down and tend to try to revolt against their oppressors. So the final imperative of colonialism is the establishment of a comprehensive system of enforcement and control. Secret police, surveillance and censorship, restrictions on freedom of association, all such heavy-handed measures tend to play their role, as fear is used to keep the local systems in line. But there is a more subtle method generally employed too, the elevation of authority and decision-making into a supranational apparatus of imperial bureaucracy, which is deliberately complex and inscrutable to the native. With decrees handed down by this faraway, by his faraway metropolitan betters, like declarations dispatched from the heights of some unseen Mount Olympus, he is conditioned to assume that any challenge to the vast machine of empire would be impossible, pointless, and against the whole inevitable tide of civilization and progress. Now, I suspect that as I've described these aspects of colonialism, the denationalization, deculturalization, division, dispossession, and domination, many of you here may have had the uncomfortable recognition that these forces seem to have been at work in your own nation. Because nearly everywhere across the Western world, the symptoms are the same. Oikophobic transnational ruling elites that openly and regularly express their fear, loathing, and contempt for the majority of their native countrymen, whom they view as deplorably backwards, uncouth, uncivilized, and really little better than savages. A concerted campaign by these elites to make people feel ashamed of and ready to atone for their past, their ancestors, their traditional culture, values, way of life, and even their inherited ethnicity. Widespread erasure of cultural touchstones and the pervasive rewriting of national histories to scrub away any sign or sources of national distinctiveness, unity, and pride. Attempts to indoctrinate new generations into an entirely new, universalized set of more progressive, read civilized, values, and to induct them into a wholly artificial pseudo-culture of cosmopolitan multiculturalism, divorced from any coherent national geography, inherited identity, or memory. Persistent efforts to elevate sovereign decision-making from the level of the democratic nation to distant supranational, read imperial, bodies such as the UN and the EU, and to reduce every Western country to Justin Trudeau's proposed vision for Canada, a, quote, post-national state where there is no core identity, only an arbitrary outline on a map, representing little more than a special economic zone amenable to our modern species of East India companies. And most glaringly of all, of course, an unrelenting torrent of mass migration, a culture and demography shaking tidal wave that, despite years of overwhelming public outcry, has gone wholly unopposed by governing elites across the West. So there is, it seems to me, no more succinct way of accurately describing the state of affairs than as a strange form of colonialism. But who or what is colonizing us? Is it some great foreign power bent on our conquest like China? No, clearly not. It is our own regimes that seem to have decided to do this to us, their own people on their own accord. The West seems to be the first civilization in history that is in the process of colonizing itself. But why? Is there some treasonous conspiracy at work? This is where Camus' insight is so helpful. He reminds us, as Nathan pointed out, that there is no conspiracy needed to explain the West's self-inflicted colonization, only the overwhelming force of modernity that he calls Replacism, the marriage of convenience, as he describes it, between post-war anti-racist moralism and global managerial capitalism, which seeks a world that is truly open because it is truly flat, a safe, conflict-free world in which any inefficient and dangerously prickly particularities and differences between peoples, produced by past, place, and preference, have been sanded away, in which the defining achievement of technocratic progress will be the, quote, global interchangeability of peoples, that is interchangeable like cogs in a machine. Or alternatively, one in which mankind has transferred into, as Camus puts it strikingly in his elegy for Enoch Powell, a Nuttula man, a homogenized paste without lumps or clots, mere undifferentiated human matter that can be spread smoothly wherever economic expediency requires. But as he writes, quote, such stabilization by these means was only possible if one imagined completely abstract men and women, naked ones, so to speak, reduced to themselves, neutered of all origin, all belonging, and also all culture. This, then, is what is colonizing us, not so much a worldly empire as a conceptual one, a utopian ideal of perfect order, a global managerial machine that seeks through its great and beneficent colonial project to erase not just any specific nation, but the very idea of a nation. Not just a culture, but the very idea of a culture. Not just a people, but the very idea of a people. But as you may have noticed recently, all around the West, the natives are growing restless. Many of us are not content to see our past erased, our cultures trashed, our nations dissolved. Suddenly, many find themselves united by a so-called populist backlash. This might be more accurately described as a shared anti-colonial struggle. Once more, the world rings out with cries for national sovereignty and self-determination, but this time for our own nations in the West. Decolonization, it turns out, might just be the great cause of social justice in our time after all. On that note, let me conclude with one final observation that I think is important. The ideology of replacism and the global machine that it animates, which seeks to flatten the whole world into what Mary Harrington memorably describes as the stiflingly inhuman nomos of the airport. This machine is, in its cold mechanism, practically defined by its complete lack of love. To love something or someone is to cherish them precisely for their unique particularity. At least for us mere mortals, universal love is an impossibility and an oxymoron. Tell a woman you love her insofar as you love all women as a universal category, and I promise this will not go well for you. But the total absence of genuine love in the great project of Replaces Globalism can help us see the reality of its opposite, that the animating force of nationalism, which we see burgeoning anew today, is not the hatred of otherness, but the love of one's own. And that the way out of the replacist nightmare is for us indeed to be found in love. Love of people, past, place, particularity, and prayer. And so I urge you to keep that in mind and to take pride when you, I hope, also take up the banner of international anti-colonial struggle and make your nation great again. Thank you.
I have been living in Hungary for the last 3 years. Hungary is an outlier in Europe. It's demonized by the people in Brussels, the regime in Brussels, the media in various European countries and in Great Britain, and even here, of course, in the United States by our media. So why do people hate Hungary so much in Europe? One of the main reasons, and this really emerged in 2015, is the Hungarians' view on migration. Hungary famously has a tough migration policy. In 2015, when millions, at least 1 million people, maybe more, surged into Europe out of the Middle East, the Hungarians weren't having it. They would not let them settle there. Germany, Angela Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das." We can do this. We can host them here. Take 1 million people into the country. Hungary wouldn't have anything to do with it, and the European elites hated it, but they didn't care, the Hungarians. I remember my first summer there in Budapest, 2021, there was a clash between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Really bad clash. Anti-Semitic pogroms and demonstrations broke out in Western European capitals, and also in New York and Los Angeles, if you remember. I, at the time, was working at the Danube Institute, whose office was on the Pest side of Budapest, and I had to walk every day to get to the office through the city's old Jewish quarter. And I remember thinking, watching on TV what was happening in other European cities, oh my God, what am I going to be dealing with? Will I be able to walk through there? Will there be military checkpoints and so on? I set out to cross the Jewish quarter. It was fine. It was fine. No police, no nothing. That evening, walking back home, I noticed Chabadniks, Haredi Jews, out with their families, walking their families, the men with their side curls, visibly Jewish, walking the streets in this major European capital, Budapest, and they were safe. They had nothing to worry about. Well, the next week after that, I went on business to Paris, and everybody I talked to in dinner parties and met for coffee, they were talking about the possibility of civil war You know, this has been, every time I've been to France in the last 20 years, this has been what people say, but with the anti-Semitic violence going on in the city that week, people were really, really scared. And I remember walking along the banks of the Seine and thinking, oh my God, Viktor Orban was right. He was right about migration. And the things I have seen in the Hungarian capital and the French capital in the space of 1 week proves it. Well, if you ask Western European liberals why Hungary has the migration policies it does, they will say because the Hungarians are bigots and xenophobes, that they are illiberal because liberalism, rightly understood, requires the free movement of peoples and also requires embracing multiculturalism and deciding and acting and governing as if no culture were better than any other. Well, Viktor Orban, who is a Calvinist, is the most explicitly Christian national leader in Europe, and it's not even close. He openly has said that Christianity is the foundation of Western civilization, and that if we lose Christianity, we lose the West. Therefore, when the Hungarian parliament, led by his Fidesz party, wrote Hungary's post-Hungarian basic law, its constitution, they wrote into those laws an affirmative foundation of Christianity and Hungary's Christian heritage as an axiomatic part of the Magyar people's identity. Now, to be fair, Hungary is not a particularly observant Christian country, but at least Christian moral teaching informs law and policy to a degree you don't see anywhere else in Europe. Imagine my shock last year when on Hungary's national holiday, one of its holidays celebrating the foundation of the country, the feast day of St. Stephen the King. I'm standing there on the hills in Buda watching a drone show to close out the fireworks, and the drones form a gigantic cross, lighted cross over Budapest. I mean, and it hung there in the sky, this massive cross. Imagine that anywhere else in Europe. Imagine that in the United States. Wouldn't happen. Happens in Hungary. And happens in Hungary not so much for an explicitly religious reason, but to recognize the fact that the founder of the Hungarian nation in the year 1000 is a saint, a king and a saint. Well, you would think that Pope Francis would like what the Hungarians are doing to defend and support Christian culture, but he doesn't see it that way. He's been very critical of Hungary with its migration policy. To me, it is beyond infuriating that this papal sentimentalism, which is shared by many of Europe's Christian bishops, is one big factor leading directly to what looks like will be Christianity's demise on the European continent. Viktor Orban knows that you cannot import a large number of people who do not share the Christian religion into a Christian nation, or at least a nation whose ancestral religion is Christianity and whose culture is built on Christian assumptions. You can't import non-Christian peoples in large numbers into that nation and keep the religion and keep the culture. He also knows, Orban does, that religion is the basis of culture. I don't know if Orban has ever read Michel Houellebecq, but I'm pretty confident that Viktor Orban, like Houellebecq, does not believe it is possible for a social order to exist without a fundamental basis in religion. Along those lines, one of the things I really admire about the Hungarian people in general is that they really do have a strong sense of themselves as a nation. That is to say, as a historical people that's distinct, that has a particular history that binds them together and binds them to their collective past. The Magyar nation, Hungary's name for itself, by the way, is Magyarország, which means Magyar nation, was formed in or near the year 1000 with the crowning of Prince István, Stephen, as king. The thing that binds the Hungarians together is not really race. Genetic studies of Hungarians, modern Hungarians, show that there's no such thing as a genetically pure Magyar. The Magyar tribes rode out of the Far East into the Carpathian Plain over 1,000 years ago, and they have become intermixed with other European peoples over the last millennium. This king, Saint István, has his relic, his dried right forearm and hand, on display in the Basilica in downtown Pest. You can walk in there and see the hand that first ruled the Hungarian nation. That's memory. But the history of the Hungarians also bonds them, and consciousness of this history. They had 150 years of Ottoman occupation, for example. They had the 1848 revolution, the failed revolution against the Habsburgs, which you walk down the streets of Central Pest and there are names of the revolutionaries, the patriots, there on the streets. The streets are named after them. They also think all the time of the Treaty of Trianon. That's something I'd never heard of before I went to Hungary. It's the 1919 treaty that imposed the settlement on Hungary after World War I. The Treaty of Trianon stripped away 2/3 of Greater Hungary's national territory, 2/3 of it. And if you want to know what this means to these people, as I did, I was curious to know this treaty I'd never heard about is the fundamental thing that everybody is thinking about when they think about their politics. I asked a friend of mine, he said, let me put it to you like this. When I want to go visit the graves of my ancestors, I have to travel abroad because of Trianon. Now, I'm not going to take sides in Trianon. I have friends in Slovakia and Romania and other places that got their nationhood because of Trianon. Nevertheless, you have to think about this, what it would feel like to an entire nation and its people to be held down and have 2/3 of your territory stripped away. That taught the Hungarians how much they stand to lose if they are at the mercy of greater powers. What also bonds the Hungarians together is mostly their unique and extremely difficult language. Seriously, I've been in Hungarian language classes this year, and it was like speaking Klingon. But I admire them for that, because even though younger people, educated people speak English, they are so proud of their language because nobody else in all the world speaks it or anything like it. This is one of the things that makes Hungarians Hungarian. And finally, I have to say, too, that Hungarians are really ornery people. Sometimes this is to their own detriment. They can be really inefficient and bureaucratic at their own expense. You say, but why do you have to do it that way? We've always done it that way. All right, fine. I said to my friend Anna, who's a Hungarian, I said, I just don't understand why you all are so stuck in your ways. Sometimes you're hurting yourself in this or that way. And Anna said, you're right. This knot-headedness we have is what makes us refuse to bend the knee to Brussels. I thought, touche, you're right. They're not going to do it because they're a bunch of knotheads, and God bless them for it. So the Hungarians, again, especially under Viktor Orban, are deeply and passionately dedicated to sovereignty. Orban has made clear that he doesn't want to tell other European nations how to run themselves. As a principled sovereigntist, Viktor Orban believes each nation has the right to decide its own form of government and its own laws according to its own traditions. Let Belgium be Belgium. Let Germany be Germany. But leave us Hungarians alone to administer our own affairs. So what does all this have to do with Renaud Camus? Well, as I understand him, the basis of Camus' opposition to mass migration is not hatred of migrants, but love of his own people, the French, their history, and their traditions. He is a left-wing homosexual atheist, but above all, he is a French patriot. His great replacement idea, as you've heard earlier, is not a conspiracy. He doesn't say that a sinister cabal got together to replace the French people. It has happened, he says, but as the working out of a number of principles within late liberalism. For example, capitalism, with its devotion to free markets, makes material prosperity the highest goal. We've seen here in our own country, so many of the business interests behind the Republican Party are very happy to open the southern border to get cheap labor in. The liberal ideal of the equality of man has been perverted to mean that it would be immoral to deny alien peoples the opportunity to settle in one's nation, no matter what impact this has on the people who are already there. The perversion of Christianity and its care for the weak and the poor has created a leadership class in Christian churches that exalts the victim and believe it is immoral, a sin before God, to reject the wretched of the earth the right to settle among you. The moral triumph of liberalism's victories against the evil of racism, and this is a victory, has been distorted such that people of other races and their interests must be valued above one's own. Indeed, we saw here in America with the New York Times Ballyhooed 1619 project, it actually tried to refound America as conceived in sin, in the deep sin of racism. Not that racism was sadly part of the culture at the founding, but it was the point of the founding. The left that embraces this hates America, and this is something you see also in Europe too among the left of their own countries. In short, the globalist, liberal, capitalist system that rules us in government, in media, in academia, and indeed in the minds of most people formed in this culture, is destroying the nations of Europe. What's more, Camus says that these ideas blind a country and a nation to the mortal threats to its own existence. Liberalism, broadly considered, has become a writ for national suicide. You cannot point out in European countries, most of them, not Hungary, that migrants and migration can be a really bad thing, a destructive thing. They will call you a racist. They will call you a fascist. Indeed, Renaud Camus is a total pariah in France. He tells the French elites what they do not want to hear. Flannery O'Connor once said, "Tenderness leads to the gas chamber." Well, what did she mean by that? She meant that compassion separated from other virtues becomes tyrannical and can lead to terrible outcomes, including extermination. In a way, that's what's happening to France today, and that's what's happening to most European nations today. All the tenderness, the compassion that comes with mass migration, that the elites say is the foundation for mass migration, it is sending those distinct nations to historical extermination. It's not happening in Hungary. In the 3 years I've been there, this is a routine experience. Western Europeans and Brits will come to the country and they'll realize after only a day or two that this is not the fascist hellhole that their media and their politicians have told them it was. The streets are clean and safe. Things are well ordered, and not because there are police on every street corner. And then, eventually, they will say without fail, gosh, this is what Europe used to be. A French friend of mine in Budapest relocated there a couple of years ago. She's from Paris. Paris is my favorite city in the world. And I asked her, this is a great city, Budapest, but why would you leave Paris? She said, I'll tell you why. Because here in Budapest, I can walk around any time of the day or night, even by myself, and not have to be afraid that I'm going to be attacked. Almost every single day in Paris, she said, migrants would harass me and my girlfriends, and they would sometimes even threaten to assault us. And even some women would spit on us. I couldn't take it anymore, and I didn't see that my country had the backbone to stop it. So I moved here. So she did. A French journalist of the left recently interviewed me in Budapest about Donald Trump and Viktor Orban in the coming election. After our talk was over, he conceded that though he cannot stand Viktor Orban, it's now becoming recognized even among the elites and the professionals in France that Viktor Orban was right about migration. One day, probably after Viktor Orban is dead, they will all admit this, that he was right. And long after Renaud Camus is dead, he will be seen and recognized and accepted as a real prophet. But history will likely remember poor Camus as a prophet without honor in his own country. Now, as an American who loves France and who is grateful for what the French people have given to this world, I'm from South Louisiana, so I have a special awareness of this, I believe that the de facto loss to the world of the French nation and its distinct and glorious culture would be a tragedy of world historical gravity. But it will happen, as Camus warns, absent a radical change of mind among the Français de souche, the native French, and then action, real action, to save themselves. Sadly, it's not clear what the French can do about it at this point that would be peaceful and orderly. France really might face civil war, and if so, God forbid, there will be blood and it will be hideous. This is not going to happen in Hungary. It will not happen because the Hungarians and their democratically elected leader, Viktor Orban, love their country's people, their history, culture, and religion more than they and he love liberalism. In 2014, Viktor Orban gave a speech in which he infamously said that he is trying to build a, quote, illiberal democracy. Well, his many foreign enemies still use this quote to condemn him, but what he meant by it, as he explained later, that he simply wanted to build his own nation's democracy on the basis of Hungary's own culture and traditions. This as distinct from the deculturizing abstractions of globalist, universalist, late liberalism. As I've said, I've been in Hungary for 3 years, and from the beginning, I've tried to get my fellow American conservatives to come over to Hungary and learn from Prime Minister Orban how to fight effectively against decadent liberalism for the sake of saving our own nation and its culture from dissolution. But not everybody can go to Hungary. Thanks to the work, though, of Louis, Betty, Ethan Rundell, and the Vauban Books team, every American can read Renaud Camus. And you should, you really should. Camus' message is not just for France, but for all Western nations besieged by this colonialism, by this sickness of decadent liberalism, a sickness that, if not arrested, can only lead to civilizational death. I don't expect, however, that Camus will be translated and published in the Hungarian language. Why should he be? The Hungarians already know what Camus has to say. They're living it out, and they don't care if liberals in other nations call them bigots. The Magyar people will not submit to colonization from Brussels or any of the foreign peoples that Brussels permits to flood into Europe. The lesson the Hungarians have to share with all of us is that fighting the kind of colonialism defined and condemned by Renaud Camus requires us all to reconcile ourselves to a kind of illiberalism without apology. It's no fun to be hated by the community of European nations, but in the fullness of time, Magyarország will endure. Better to suffer the insults of right-thinking foreigners than to suffer the loss of your people or set the stage for a bloody civil war as the only realistic way to save your nation from its demise. This, I'm afraid, is more than can be said confidently for the rest of Europe. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for ISI again to underscore the importance of having a forum where we can discuss things without that our university culture seems too terrified to entertain. And Camus is certainly one of those. So my interest in my brief reflections, it does not fall on demographic change, rapid demographic change, a reality that Camus has dubbed the great replacement, nor is it Replacism, the larger phenomenon, which I think both of our Nathans have really addressed, the technological imperative that reduces the human person to a resource. Instead, I'm interested in the condemnation of Camus and the censorship of his views. The conspiracy of silence that forbids public discussion is what is arguably the most consequential historical development in my lifetime. And the fact that we are not supposed to even see or certainly not discuss these realities. The catechesis has been relentless. Diversity is our strength, relentless catechesis. We're not permitted to speak about or even see the moral and spiritual costs of mass migration. So what accounts for this extraordinary prohibition? Camus points us in the direction of an answer to why we're in this atmosphere of prohibition against even seeing, much less discussing, social realities. And it's this: the specter of Adolf Hitler haunts the West, requiring from us every kind of sacrifice to prevent his return. As Alec Reary observes in a recent First Things article, after World War II, the Christian story lost its grip on the Western imagination. Therefore, we have a difficulty ordering our common life around a shared conception of the triumph of that which is good. For the last few decades, we've satisfied ourselves with a shared conception of evil. Hitler talk about the great replacement, Hitler replaced Jesus as our pole star. The incarnation of divine goodness gave way to, and this is Camus' term, the absolute embodiment of evil. Now, Camus, I think, is certainly right about the second career of Hitler. He is an ever-present threat. He's the sword of Damocles that requires us to organize every aspect of society and culture to prevent his return. The upshot has been an essentially nihilistic politics, one organized to prevent metaphysical evil rather than to preserve and promote the ordinary goods of common life. In our political culture, the German dictator serves, and again, Camus' language here, it serves as the absolute weapon of language, its supreme fulmination, the atomic bomb of maledictions. I mean, all we need to think about is the last electoral cycle, where Ann Applebaum can pen an article about how Donald Trump is Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot all rolled into one. So, I mean, she kind of exemplifies this organization of the political imagination of the West around preventing the return of Hitler. And paradoxically, in his second career as the embodiment of absolute evil, rather than guarding the West against harm, Hitler has conquered and destroyed Europe. Being unable to conquer militarily, he is conquered in his death and resurrection as the absolute embodiment of evil, as he's managed to conquer and destroy Europe spiritually. Here's a marvelous and accurate image from Camus. I got to say, it's just a delight. I mean, he's really a masterful rhetorician. So Camus' language. This is Camus. Europe is like a patient who has suffered from a terrible cancer, Hitlerism, and who is endlessly operated on and reoperated on by terrifically thorough, if perhaps not always very professional surgeons. Having decided not to leave even the least hint of disease, not a single area exposed to danger, even if it is totally healthy, no lingering concerns, however minute, once they have been imagined, these surgeons attend to the most hidden recesses. The trouble is that, in following this regimen, these overzealous practitioners have left the patient more than 3/4 dead. For in their glee they have they have removed all vital functions, all instincts for survival, and even the desire for life. Now, I've made a similar argument in my book, Return of the Strong Gods. Hitler was not a foreign invader. He was gestated in the womb of the West and emerged in the decades of civilizational catastrophe that marked the first half of the 20th century, to which, of course, he made his own signal contributions. 1914 marked the beginning of a senseless conflict that consumed millions of lives in inconclusive battles. Communist revolution in Russia led to the deaths of millions more. Then in 1939, an even more destructive war was launched that was marked by genocide and indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. The effect of those decades was spiritually devastating. Although, as Camus notes, it took some years after 1945 for the weight of catastrophe to be fully felt. By the mid-1960s, the West was defining itself as anti-totalitarian, anti-fascist, anti-racist, and anti-nationalist. These anti-imperatives, as I call them, these anti-imperatives were seen as ministering to a comprehensive and all-important never again imperative, which of course requires us to keep Hitler ever before our minds as the evil whose return we must prevent. And we do so by relentlessly promoting an open society consensus. Multiculturalism, we're told, will stymie our inner racist. Dissolution of the nation will forestall any return of destructive nationalism. And meanwhile, denouncing the slightest dissent from the open society consensus as far right or fascist will keep everybody with the program. I mean, this has, I think, been the growing intensity, ironically, after the end of the Cold War. Instead of relaxing our vigilance, it was redoubled. Now, love is jealous. It seeks to defend, protect, and promote the beloved. As I argue in my book, love makes a home. And Pache Carl Schmitt, solidarity does not require enemies, although of course it is true that we often have them. Shared loves unite people, and they serve as the foundation for a way of life that wins our loyalty. In his second career, Hitler has motivated an assault on love. We are told not to love our country, for that will make us racists, fascists, nationalists, xenophobes, and any other number of evils. We're not to love our civilization, for to do so will make us fearful of the other. We are not even to love truth, for doing so paves the way for authoritarianism. All you need to do is read Karl Popper's Open Society and its enemies to realize that any strong commitment to truth is a royal road to authoritarianism. And we're certainly not to love God. After all, he's the paradigmatic totalitarian who demands devotion, our devotion of heart, mind, and soul. Now, Camus has formulated a moral political program that he labels in no sense. It's an imperative to do no harm, to not destroy, to not perpetuate no-sense destruction, harm and destruction. Now, avoiding and preventing harm is surely an admirable ambition. But of course, it is shared by those who are so eager to silence him. The Open Society consensus, in fact, is a harm prevention program. The anti-imperatives are meant to prevent the return of Hitler. They promise to make another Auschwitz impossible, if we will but redouble our efforts. At their most extreme, those who propound anti-Western ideologies, such as settler colonialism, and who demand land acknowledgments ascribed to the doctrine of innocence, harm prevention. In the shadow of Auschwitz, they deem Western civilization the source of evil. So if we want to prevent harm, we have to undermine, destroy Western civilization. The only way to prevent the return of Hitler is to destroy every jot and tittle of the culture that produced him. And this is well underway, as Camus recognizes this destruction. In my estimation, the post-war generation consolidated around the Open Society consensus because they believed that over-consolidated societies and strong loves and loyalties were the greatest threat to human flourishing. They imagined that their assault on shared loves would reduce harm, was a reduction of nuisance. And perhaps they were right at the outset. Maybe if I was living in 1949, I would have signed on to the Open Society consensus and its attempt to reduce harm by reducing passions. But it is 2024, not 1939. Globalization has undermined economic solidarity. Anti-nationalism has eroded patriotic sentiments. Institutions from marriage to the universities are in crisis. Severe declines in fertility rates and rising rates of immigration fray social bonds and threaten cultural continuity. Today, the West is threatened by disillusion, not by over-consolidation. Let me put our situation in Camus' famous terms. The Great Replacement, at least as it's caricatured, will not happen, at least not anytime soon. France is not on the cusp of Islamification and the institution of a new kind of nation. Our patterns of immigration in the United States are not as Islamic heavy as those that obtain in Europe. But we, too, are not anywhere near replacement, if by that term we mean that the native-born peoples are giving way to the successor people capable of constituting a new and fundamentally different society, as happened to the American Indians. That's not what we're facing. Instead, France, America, and other Western countries are threatened by disintegration, a condition of shallow, spiritually dispiriting incoherence. In these emerging circumstances, I find it very unlikely that a caliphate will emerge. Instead, a modicum of order and prosperity will be maintained by technocratic methods of social control. Brad Watson had a very nice evocation of the COVID era with the fifth column, with the private volunteers of enforcement that were so eager to denounce those of us who spoke against the COVID lockdowns, as well as by surveillance of our every action and communication in the public-private partnership of tech companies with the intelligence community. So shared methods of technocratic control in this dispirited, disaggregated, incoherent society, as well as the continued expansion of commodification and consumption. Think of IVF and the production of children as the condensed symbol, if you will, for the commodification and the transformation of all social relations into commodity and consumption, the logic of commodity and consumption. Alexander Kojève formulated this vision of the future, and he welcomed it. He called it the universal and homogeneous state. That's more likely to be our future, not a caliphate. Now, obviously, in conclusion, the election of Donald Trump suggests a rebellion against this future. And it'll be interesting to see if we can replace replacism with something that is more humane. And as Nathan Levin suggested, that we must do so by renewing shared loves. Family, nation, God. For we do not treat the things we love as replaceable. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists, our two Nathans, Rusty and Rod. Those were wonderful talks. We can move now to the Q&A. There's a microphone over there.
Thanks very much to you all. I think this is mostly for Nathan Pinkoski, but it may affect others as well. How far back does Camus think the technological philosophical conditions for replacism go? I mean, because you mentioned Taylor, and that would be the early 20th century, but as far back as Machiavelli, you have this rejection of ornatus, the idea that we can, if we strip away ornamentation and all that clothes our speech and our thought, we'll get to the raw, real essence of the thing, which seems to be just matter to be shaped by will. Right? Is he interested in sort of a grand genealogy of Western ideas like that, or is it much more a kind of the real technological possibility of that concerns him?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's certainly the interest in a broader genealogy. He has, in the beginning of his second to last book called Dispossession, he has this remark about how difficult it is to find the origin of the origin. So you could declare one point to be an origin, but then you have to pose the question, what's the origin of that? And you go back further and further. So there's a nod towards the kind of intellectual genealogy that you're referring to. That said, though, and this is what I think is particularly interesting for him, is that kind of account is less significant for him than to try to understand how we ended up with the radical social, anthropological, ontological transformations that came about in the 20th century. And that's his focus on managerialism for that, and looking at Taylor as a key thinker in that narrative, it sets him apart from those who might be interested in an intellectual genealogy. Because what he's really talking about is the implementation of a particular set of practices and looking at where that came from. So one of the lines he has is that Marx is to Marxism, Taylor is to Replacism what Marx is to Marxism. And there's an intellectual genealogy there that we can, of course, note. But just to stress the point, what we get from Camus is perhaps, if it's not a triggering remark, just to say in this circles, pace to Richard Weaver, but ideas aren't as important as we might think they are. Practices are. And the practice of managerialism, as it was developed and implemented through Taylorianism, through Taylor, is the kind of thing that fascinates Camus. If we want to understand how we have changed our view of ourselves, then the account of ideas needs to perhaps be set aside in order to pay attention to these other figures.
I would love to read a treatment of Camus being read through the ideas of Philip Rieff, because what I've identified in my Live Not by Lies book as soft totalitarianism is really based on the therapeutic, the triumph of the therapeutic, which is to say the idea that we must do whatever we can to reduce anxiety and bring about social harmony and also psychological harmony. And you see this all over the Replacism thing, right? Especially when you have the elites talking about history and culture and all that. They want to find peace, which is to say their own sense of harmony within and get over their own self-hatred by destroying everything around them that makes them anxious. So I think it's clearly true that managerialism, as Camus said, is a big part of it, but I also think the therapeutic is the triumph of the therapeutic mentality paired with managerialism. That has become a very deadly thing.
Yes, right here.
Yes, thank you. My question is for the whole panel. Do you guys think that Elon Musk's up-and-coming Optimus humanoid robots is the next stage of Camus' Replacism? And if so, what does that say about Musk's role in Trump's re-election campaign and his future administration?
Well, I think the humanoid robots are really stupid. The whole idea of humanoid robots is to sort of create this person that you don't need when you have a robot that could be much more efficient if it didn't look like a human. But that's sort of an aside. I think what you should think of with Musk, and this is a very interesting point given the context of this conference, right after Trump's victory, Elon Musk is not in any sense a conservative. He is a progressive. He believes in the need for progress in order to advance humankind into the future, to Mars, and so on. And in that sense, he's a progressive. He's also right-wing. He's right-wing because he believes in meritocracy and natural hierarchies and so on. So he's a right-wing progressive, which we're not used to talking about. But I think we've talked a little bit at this conference about the old fusionism, the fusionism of the Cold War. I think the new fusionism is the tech right, the right-wing progressives of the West Coast and Silicon Valley, combined with the traditional right, the traditionalist right, including the religious right. And in some ways, that's a very powerful and dynamic coalition. In some ways, it's very inherently unstable. So we're going to see what happens with that. But I think that is this push towards technological dynamism that's going to come from that segment of the right, which is now a very powerful segment because Elon is basically responsible for Trump's victory. That is going to push directly against some of the concerns of the other half of the right on, say, IVF and reproductive technology.
And my sense is that the point of convergence, or the point that will that will encourage diffusionism, is love of country. In a competitive relation to China, will demand, especially military technology, it will demand a rapid, I mean, we'll have to win the technological race. And so that's the point where you can kind of join them, but I agree, I think it's going to be a very unhappy marriage.
Yeah, I think the next frontier of replacism is artificial intelligence, AI, which will replace the human. I'm already hearing, and I'm sure all of you who teach in college classes know about the students who cheat by having AI write their paper so they don't have to think. As AI becomes more and more advanced and more integrated into everyday life, we will inevitably outsource our thinking to AI. And if you read some people on this, some of the people who have a very dark vision of what's coming, I think one of them is, I recommend, is Anton Barbecue. It's possible then that we will start to see AI as effectively gods. That is, the sources of ultimate wisdom. They're flawless. They can't make a mistake. We will outsource our thinking to them, and we will start doing what they tell us to do without even knowing what's happening, because it reduces our anxiety. And in this case, man will have been merged with the machine, and indeed, the human will have been replaced by the machine. Ironically, the people who are likely to survive this are those living in the poorest countries of the third world where they don't have this technology. They will still have their humanity. And if you read Brave New World, these people are going to be the John the Savages of the future, who are raised on the reservation outside the perfectly managed, therapeutic, technicized society.
Just one thing to add to that, Rod, that I think is important, is that you've talked about the therapeutic and this need for basically safety, which I think comes directly out of the second career of Adolf Hitler that Rusty's described, of this need to basically create a new man that is safe for liberal democracy. So, and I think that this issue of AI, that's also what you're getting at, that AI does not have, potentially we could create this AI that isn't human, and that's its advantage. It doesn't have the flaws that led to Adolf Hitler, so therefore we should just surrender everything to it. And so this is a form of depoliticization in the sense of the Carl Schmitt's idea that liberalism is this drive to depoliticize politics, to take the political out of life so that we're not in danger. I think all of this sort of flows into the same direction that you've observed here.
Right here. Nicholas.
That's a great panel. I think this question is probably mostly for Rusty, although I think all of you can probably answer it. Because you talked a lot about these antis in the post-war period, what occurs to me is that among the anti-communists in the post-war right, really before we even talk about fusionism, we talk about McCarthy. And the reason I bring that up is that they openly rejected the open society. One thing those who supported McCarthy did, somebody like Wilmore Kendall is a great example of this, is to say there are two concepts. There's the open society and there's the consensus society, which is where you're really talking about your majority people in your nation. And when you have that, it requires actually being something else, which is not anti-censorship. Now, that's being talked about a lot right now, that Trump's victory and what the right's doing now is we're the party of anti-censorship. Maybe my question there is the caution and the lesson from 70 years ago is to be the party of anti-censorship is temptation towards being actually the party in favor of the open society. because in order to be in favor of that consensus society that Kendall was talking about, he said it's a challenge, something like subversives, like communist subversives. And the reason they identified it as such is it's not just that they're communists, it's that they're atheistic materialists. And that was actually the fundamental challenge that Kendall, Whittaker Chambers, and others identified was the true challenge to the West and why it might require something like this.
So what's the question?
So the question is, the lesson from 70 years ago is that we can't simply be the party of my question is it that we cannot be the party of merely anti-censorship because that would make us in favor of the open society?
I agree, can't just be a party of anti-censorship. I don't think Trump was successful politically on those grounds, although people are very frustrated by hectoring, the hectoring they're subjected to, by human resource folks and all that kind of thing, for sure. But it's pretty clear that globalization and the way it's undermined middle-class prosperity and immigration were far more powerful drivers. And those are both, they both speak to what I would call a solidarity theme, not individual freedom or freedom from theme. It's not a negative liberty message, as freedom from censorship is a negative liberty message. Instead, it's I guess it was a kind of a positive liberty message. We can only be free together if we actually have a country. So that would be my response. But I think it's a good warning. It's a helpful warning. That episode about McCarthy just underscores how completely the open society consensus triumphed. And I would just go back to Machiavelli, William of Ockham, nominalism is the root of all evil, the Reformation is the root of all evil. I just think our bodies have bad DNA. We all have bad DNA. And the question is, why would we subject ourselves so willingly and so eagerly to this bad DNA? And why would we suppress the, if you will, the countervailing tendencies within Western culture? And I think the answer really has to do with the events of the 20th century. And that's why I think his image of the second career of Hitler is just so helpful, that it's a helpful way of dramatizing the way in which we've responded as a civilization to our own self-inflicted wounds with an assault on love. Just to put it frankly, we've had a 70-year assault on love. And the effect of it is to make our ruling class, they find it very difficult to formulate patriotic sentiments because they've been so thoroughly catechized in the anti-imperatives that all undermine the possibility of shared loves. So we're at the end of that cycle. So I'm with Nathan, yes, reflect, do genealogies, reflect, it's good to know like where intellectually dangerous and mistaken patterns are from, but don't think that history is like dominoes falling, a kind of negative Hegelianism, Occam, and then you have the universal homogeneous state at the end. There's an element of freedom that runs all through the course of human events, and people made decisions about what to emphasize and what not to emphasize because they wanted to reduce harm. And we're in a period of time where we need to flip that switch. The imperative is not to reduce harm, but actually to promote good. And that's a different project than preventing harm. Sometimes if you prevent all harms, no good will come. We won't be able to pursue any goods. We won't be, as Rod said, we'll turn everything over to some entity that will provide us with complete and total security. We'll debase our humanity.
The machine, open source machine.
Yes.
How much time do we have left, by the way?
Maybe one more question.
Okay, let's see. Over on this side. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
As you fellows were talking, the figure of Marx was sort of looming in the back of my mind. I mean, he would certainly argue, or Engels explicitly argues that there's a direct line from the sort of atomized materialism of Hobbes to the commodification and atomization of human beings. And either that will lead to the universal workers' revolution or the servile state. So at the level of economics, at the level of the economic system, I wonder what solutions do you propose, or what are different ways we can think about economics and to sort of shift gears away from heading towards this universal homogeneous state?
Well, one would be to not make economics the queen of the sciences. That would be helpful. I mean, clearly, we are, in fact, very eager to promote and maximize our utility. And so economic analysis is quite useful. But we're more than that. And what has atrophied in our intellectual culture, I think people under 50, they don't look to literature or philosophy, or certainly not theology, for how to orient themselves, what it means to be human. They look to brain science and game theory and economics. So, like, why is my dating life so unsatisfying? Well, it's the marriage market or the dating market and so on and so forth. And so we have to dethrone economics as the queen of the science.
I was going to say, just on this, on the notion of a new fusionism, this is one of the questions, I think, or contradictions that lie within, and it's going to depend. Everything is going to depend on how we answer the question of what it is to be human and to remain human with all these technological pressures and temptations. Because if one is right to see that the driving force of this coalition, unlike, say, the old fusionism, isn't a desire for individual liberty, but rather an imperative for technological progress, an unyielding demand to have more technological progress. And answering the question of what is human is key to that. And that requires us to rethink whole aspects of our society. I'll give one example, which perhaps also speaks to another tension in this new fusionism. It's on the subject of abortion. It's clear that there's not, at least right now in the US, a popular majority willing to contemplate wide-scale restrictions on abortion, that when these things come up for ballot, our side tends to lose. But what would it be to have an economy that encouraged people to make decisions away from abortion, for instance? And here we're talking about family policy. We're talking about all kinds of assistance that can be offered to those who are in crisis pregnancies. But I do think the broader question of that is one that Christopher Lasch pointed out years ago in what lurks behind the abortion debate. It's the sense that children are inconvenient to professional success. And in order to get around that problem, you have to reconceive what the purpose of professional success looks like. What does it look like? More occasions for part-time work, et cetera. All these sorts of things the policy wonks can discuss in detail. But the question of what is human here is key for us to answer if this new fusionism isn't going to devour us, our humanity.
Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and feel free to check out one of the recommended videos.